Good evening and welcome to Democratic TV, television produced in the community, by the community, and for the community. Tonight I have my guests tonight are State Representative Gloria Johnson, who is in her, sixth term, sixth session, or sixth yearly session, 6 years ago. And during that time, she has really been the voice of the voiceless, in a sense that she brings the voice of people who don't get access to the powers that be in public policy. And Lori's done an extremely good job of that. I'm proud to have her on. And the reason I say that is because I don't think we talk about that enough and how important she is to us. Also with her is another person who has been really a delight for me to meet over the last year, Amy Frogge. Amy is the former member of the Metro Nashville Board of Education. She spent 8 years in the Board of Education, and she came out with her sanity. And she is also a member of a group called Pastors for Children and another group called TPAC. So she is an activist in educational policy, and she is tireless, and from my observation, working. So we're really lucky to have these two people with us tonight, because tonight we're going to talk about the state budget, how it affects school policy, how it's going to affect children at the grade school, high school level directly. And I think there's some scary things in it that we all need to know about. And so, Gloria, scare us.
Okay. Well, we've been trying to do that for a while and inform you. It's a statewide issue, and it's great to have Amy in Middle Tennessee and voices all across the state, because there's so much to talk about that's kind of culminating right now. Something that, it's funny, I was talking to Amy the other day, and she was saying, we've been yelling about this for a long time, and people have they've been slow to get on the train and slow to listen. But just about this public defunding of public education and this attempt to privatize our public schools, and everything is sort of culminating right now. The idea that make teachers look bad, they're really trying to stress teachers are teaching bad subjects, all this book banning and teachers are making kids upset with what they're teaching. It all comes together with this idea that they want to use vouchers for with public tax dollars and send kids to charter schools, which are not true traditional public schools. All of it in the way to privatize our public ed and get those dollars, public tax dollars, into corporate hands is quite frankly what it's about. And so if you want to talk briefly, Amy, about what you saw and talk about how those privatizers, when they ran, candidates against you for school board.
Well, so what we're witnessing in Tennessee in general, as you mentioned, it's a playbook, privatization playbook. It's playing out across the country and city after city and state after state. And it really is a David Goliath battle between local volunteer public education advocates and literally billionaires that are funding the movement across the nation. And so what they want is to get access for private interest to public tax dollars with as little regulation as possible. And they create this narrative of failing schools, and they want to create distrust about our public neighborhood schools, like you mentioned. They want to create controversy, this critical race theory debate we're having now, which is something that's not actually taught in public schools as part of that effort. But there's a lot of attacks on teachers. All of the excessive standardized testing is part of creating this failing schools narrative. The goal is to bring in charter schools and vouchers that are ways for corporate entities to make money from our children. And that's the crux of it. And I got involved in this about 10 years ago when I first ran for school board, and I thought I was just running for the local school board. I kind of got talked into running because I was a very active PTO mom, and I asked how much, I needed to run for the race. And they said maybe $10,000-$15,000 for your race. And I thought, okay, maybe I can do that. And my opponent ended up raising a record amount of money that year, which was $125,000. And I think Nashville at that time didn't really understand what was hitting us. It was a lot of out-of-state money, dark money, out-of-state organizations involved, funded again by these certain billionaires that are funding all of the school board elections across the U.S. The second time I ran, I was a target because I was actually trying to fight for public education. And that time, the privatizer spent over $200,000 just on my seat. So what's happened is these local school board races now have become like state races as far as funding goes. Just an enormous amount of money has to be spent. And both of my races, I was outfunded 5-1, but we were able to win because of grassroots, really. But it's very difficult for regular, parents who are involved in their schools now to have a voice in policy setting. And so they're attacking public schools at all these different levels, at your level, at the legislative level, and also locally.
Yeah, absolutely. For $200,000 for a school board race is just completely outrageous. I think the most they came at me was $700,000 one year in my race. And it's just like, most of that money were these outside Tennessee Federation for Children, which is funded by Betsy DeVos, all of these groups associated with either Governor Haslam or Governor Lee with all this money. And it's like, if these folks really cared about public ed, why wouldn't they be putting these millions in our schools? But instead, they're putting these millions in candidates who don't support public schools. It really should be all you need to know about who folks are and what their goals are.
I don't think they support children. I mean, really, that the children have been lost in this thing. They have decided that there's an enormous a pile of tax money that just there for their taking, and they figured out clever ways to get it and kind of hide that from the rest of us. This just needs to be shouted to the mountaintop all the time, So
yeah, we even had some PowerPoints of theirs from some of their hedge fund managers and that sort of thing, basically talking about how some kids brought in more money than other kinds of kids. Just really horrific to see how they talked about children as profit for them. They're profit makers more so than folks they were concerned about their education. And so with all those things culminating right now, and we had Governor Lee's voucher plan that passed a couple of years ago with bribes. So now we're seeing that stalled by the courts. And I think that what he is doing is trying to use charter schools as a way to get to that privatization, because vouchers are kind of stalled right now. And so they keep moving the line on charters. Initially, they said charters would have to be approved by the local. And then what they found out were locals didn't want most of them. And so what they decided, well, no, we need somebody at the state level to look at these ones that are turned down and see if maybe they should be approved anyway, and we'll control them. And so they did that. And now what they're doing is they're totally doing away with this new bill, doing away with the local even having that first say or that first whack at it, to say, like Rutherford County did, we don't want these these charter schools in our district. They're not ready. I don't like their plan for special ed. We say no. They go to the new charter commission and they're immediately approved. And now we've got a bill that's going to even take away the first swat that the local gets. And I think taking the local out of the picture is a horrible mistake. Amy, how do you feel about that one?
Completely agree. So the bill that's pending is scary for a lot of reasons. It removes local control, but also what they're really after is access to facilities. And so the sponsor of the bill, Mark White, has said that's why he really ran the bill. And so this bill would allow charter schools access to public schools under a certain capacity for $1. So they basically would just have access to buildings. One of the primary drivers of the charter school movement is these lucrative land deals that they get through charters. So what happens is an investor, and really truly, it is no exaggeration to say that the people behind this are a bunch of hedge funders, venture capitalists. They're coming from New York, California. I mean, these are just out of state people seeking profit. And so they will come in. Andre Agassi did this here in Nashville. He is he builds facilities for charter schools and makes money off that. And he's been very, very open about the fact that this is for profit. But they come in and they'll buy a piece of land, and then they will use the public tax dollars to pay off that investment. So at the end of the day, instead of us funding, say, our local neighborhood school with our tax dollars, we funded this investment for an investor. At the same time, they can charter schools can get facilities fees out of the yearly payments that we give them. They get management fees sometimes. They get growth fees. So Rocket Ship here, for example, forced open 3 schools that the local school board did not approve. They are performing dismally, and they're getting $200,000 per school. They can go take that and open new charter schools in another state with our tax dollars. So this is just wildly unregulated. There's an immense amount of grift. And I'll give you one. I saved a few of these examples because the stories, I think if people understood how many of these charter school leaders are being indicted for just stealing funds meant for children, I think that it really resonates when you recognize how little regulation. But there's one school that we had here called Knowledge Academies. We started having a lot of problems with the school. They were using uncertified teachers. They were understaffed. They were changing grades and transcripts. They were requiring poor kids to buy uniforms. It's another way they make money, is because the people running the school can require students to buy things from their companies. They were running for-profit businesses out of the companies. They had horrible academic results. Then they lost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, they said, in an online phishing scheme. That's what they said. The leader who founded it disappeared. They were not serving special needs students, EL students, common problem. And then we were trying to shut the school down. I mean, no question that it was complete grift. We were trying to shut the school down. We finally got it shut down. It went on appeal to the state. State forced it back open. So it's been open the last couple of years. It's now running at a $7.9 million deficit. And so we don't know where our tax dollars are going. And because the state now has control, not locals, we have to not only keep these schools open, but our local school boards, we're paying for these schools. In Nashville, we pay 2/3 the cost of this school that we don't want, that has lost money at best and is stealing money at worst. So that's a good example.
Thank you. That's exactly right. What we're seeing is that we're seeing schools shut down, and it's frustrating. You're all set to go to a school, and then for whatever reason that charter school closes. You're not going to see that happen with a traditional public school. We're not going to have folks that are just left with no school to go to in just a few months when school opens back up. So certainly the problems in charter. The other thing, of course, is that what we don't see are charter schools performing better than their public schools peers. And charter schools get to cherry pick who they take, yet they still can't demonstrate that they are performing better than public schools. And that's pretty much in every state across the board. You will find an occasional charter school that is performing better than its than a regular school, but it's an outlier. It's definitely an outlier. We see the same with voucher schools. When you check a child who's going to a private school with a voucher in states that have vouchers, they perform no better than their public school peers, and often it is worse in many states. So what we know for a fact, and what we don't seem to talk about very much, is charter schools and vouchers are not good solutions. They are not being successful. I was meeting with a group of charter school folks today, and they said, well, we're getting better. Well, you guys have been at it for 10 years at least, and you're still no better. I don't know what you mean that you are getting better, because that's not what we're seeing at all. And we are seeing a massive drain on our public school tax dollars. And my fear with this budget, it's my understanding that my colleagues across the aisle might have their hands on that budget today. I haven't been able to see it, and I've heard that from some of them they don't understand it. But there might be something floating around out there right now. We're supposed to hear about it all tomorrow, so we will certainly know more about the budget tomorrow. But I think what we know already from what's been told to us is that they talk about a student-centered funding model, and what that means to those of us who know how this works and have been following this privatization for a long time is the higher the dollar amount you put on the student, then those dollars will follow a student to a charter school or to a voucher, as a voucher for private schools. So I think it's going to be a vehicle to transfer a whole lot of dollars, not just the 32 million they've talked about that are going to charters, but so many more dollars that follow children that they're going to be sending to these 50 to 100 Hillsdale charters that Governor Lee had already made a deal on back in September. We have a tape of him talking about with the president of Hillsdale about this deal on this 50 to 100 charters. And he acted like the whole budget thing was a new idea starting in October. So we know that those 18 committees and that tour around the state, where most people, most of the comments went to, we want our public tax dollars funding our traditional public schools. That's what families ask for in those talks around the state. But he already had the deal done before he created those committees and started that tour. That was performance art. I don't know, Amy, if you feel differently about that.
I completely agree. And I think honestly, the people running those meetings were a little surprised that the only feedback they got was, we don't want vouchers, we want funding. And I had some technical problems. So is everything looking okay? You hear me? I was kind of in and out for a minute. But I had a few points about what you've already mentioned. So first of all, as far as performance goes, our group looked at charter school performance statewide, and what the results are incredibly dismal. There are about 116, I believe, charter schools operating across the state. Almost all of them are in Memphis and Nashville. Only 5 of that over 100 charter schools have a success rate of 20% or higher. So they have dismal results. And the other thing about funding that I think a lot of people don't understand is not only are charter schools, they get a lot of advantages. You mentioned that they will cherry pick the students they want. They cancel out students they don't want. They typically don't want to serve English learners and special needs students, which came up in that example I gave you before, because they are more costly and challenging to educate, and they just don't test as well. And so they're after test scores because that's what keeps their doors open and brings in more money in the form of students. But also, charter schools get paid first, and they always get the full per pupil amount because of state law, and also because of the contracts we have with them. And so the problem we have chronically underfunded schools in Tennessee, really for the past 30 years. And at the same time, you've got charter schools that are always getting funded at the expense of the rest of the system. So when there are budget cuts, the budget cuts are going to come from the traditional schools never the charter schools. And so what you've done is set up this inequitable two-tiered system of the haves and the have-nots. And the charter schools always have the advantage as far as the students they serve and the funding. And that creates a recipe for failure for the traditional schools. So you're kind of creating this death spiral for the traditional public schools where they're now serving higher need students with less resources. So it's not just about, hey, we're going to give parents another choice. If you're creating another option, it is hurting the rest of the students. And those are always the most vulnerable, the most marginalized kids. You know, the parents, the kids that don't have parents that transport them to school or that put them in a lottery. And those are the children that have to have resources to succeed. So that, I think, has been probably the most disturbing part of the privatization discussion for me, because we really have to be focused on those children as their advocates.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people, because there is a lottery, a lot of times they don't understand. They think, well, everybody has the opportunity. But if you've been in schools and you've taught in schools, you know that there are kids whose parents are not able to fill out those applications, whether it's because they're working so many jobs or they're just not able to fill them out, and or they're not able to commit to the hour or two a week that they're supposed to volunteer at that school because they're working 2 and 3 jobs. So what you find are the kids with the least support are the ones that aren't able to fill out those applications. And the kids that are taken are the ones that already have the most support. So you're taking the kids with the most support and the parents that support the school out and leaving it with the kids that need the most support with less support and less money. And so it's terrible for our kids. And the group that I just spoke with, what I tried to make them understand is if we put all the teachers in the BEP and we really adequately funded public education, every LEA would be able to offer some choices like we do in Knox County. You can go to magnet programs, you can go to career prep, you can go to STEM Academy. I want rurals to have those choices as well. And if we fully fund them, we can. But if we're going to be sending money out to charters and vouchers, let me tell you something. Some of these rural communities might think they're immune, but it's going to make the state pot of money much smaller, and rural counties are going to feel it first.
Right.
And this budget of the governor's had some little things to tempt some of the rural counties in the first few years with some extra money. But when that ends, and even before that, they're going to be the first ones hit, and they're going to be the hardest hit and the hardest to make it up. And so even if there may not be charters or vouchers in their county, it's going to affect their budget negatively. It will impact their budget. And they need to look at some of these other states and how it has affected rural schools to understand that we're all in this together, and charters or vouchers are going to hurt every county.
And the ultimate result too, and we had to do this here in Nashville, is when you are bringing in a whole other, basically we're funding 2 systems now that are competing for resources, one with all the advantages, which would be the charter schools. But when you do that, the public schools become both under-enrolled and underfunded. And ultimately, that ends up, the district has to make hard choices. So first you might cut arts programs, or you might cut sports programs, or you might cut school nurses. What can we take away from the traditional schools in order to pay for the charter sector that we're required to fund no matter what? And in the long run, a lot of times you end up closing neighborhood schools to continue paying for the charter sector, which we're required to pay by state law. And that happened in Nashville. We had a budget year where we had to make some cuts, and the charter sector was continuing to grow because they were adding grade levels each year. So the charter sector was going to get an additional $6.6 million while we had to cut everything else. So we ended up closing 3 under-enrolled neighborhood schools. And that, again, is part of the playbook. It's played out in all these cities, in New York and Chicago, massive school closures because of too many charter schools. And these little rural counties I think they don't know what's going to hit them, because if you bring in one charter school in a very small district, it could easily collapse a school. So, we've dealt with it in Nashville for a long time. It may seem sort of innocuous, but the fiscal impact is very real and very dangerous.
Yeah, I know you guys have a huge fiscal impact. You've had studies on that. I think that one thing about Knoxville only having the one charter school, we saw an impact immediately in our budget. It was really easy to see in a line item budget where we were $3.9 million short in our budget. They were going to cut part of our magnet program, and they were going to cut Project Grad, which is an amazing program for all our underperforming high schools and for kids going to college and getting kids to graduate. And so we were $3.9 million short in our budget. Our charter school was costing $3.6 million. I think there's really nothing that makes that picture more clear of how that affected our one charter school, how that affected our budget and caused that problem. And I'll just never forget, that was the only time that I've ever just seen it like that up on one of their own PowerPoints, that this is so clear when you have one charter and you've got this budget, and you could see exactly what the problem was. And that charter school was, it takes a few kids out of various elementary schools at that time. It didn't free up the cost of a teacher's salary. It didn't free up building costs. It created double. And I probably should hit that. Apparently, we're hearing there might be $125 million in the budget for teachers. Ultimately, that's going to be about $100 a month for teachers. And I don't even know if that's going to bring us up to more than 10 years ago. Teachers today are making less than they made 10 years ago. I hope this will bring them up to that, but I'm not sure if it's going to be enough to do that. So we make this investment. We need to make it count, and we need to make it count for the kids. And I'm afraid the governor's budget's not going to do that. We'll know tomorrow.
Right. We're out of time tonight. We need to continue this discussion. So whenever you're ready to do that, let's do that. And I would say to the audience, thank you for listening. You've had a great discussion tonight, Gloria and Amy. And to our audience, tune in next week, 9:30 on Friday night for another interesting discussion on public issues in Knox County. Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.